Hi everybody, happy Tuesday. I promised you that I would bring you some online material for this week since most of you are on your block week, those of you who are in the ECE program. I hope that that's going well for you so far. So today what I'm going to do is post this video and the accompanying PDF notes of the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to take you through. All about persuasive and negative messages. And the reason that we need to cover this material is that we will be working with persuasive messages, especially for your final assignment, assignment 4, which will be due the end of next week, which will in fact be the end of our time together before Tanya comes in for the second half of your course. So I'm going to pop open a PowerPoint slide and I'm going to go through these with you. And we will talk about persuasive and negative messages. You may remember this graphic because I showed it in class last week. It illustrates the two organizational patterns when we're talking about routine correspondence, documents, our everyday emails, letters, and memos. We're most of the time using that direct approach. So right now you're working on your third assignment and you're practicing using the direct approach, which means front-loading your purpose. So stating really early on in the message, maybe the first sentence or two, certainly in the first paragraph, the main idea of your message, whether that's an email, a memo, a report, a letter, whatever it happens to be. And the reason that we do that is because it saves the reader time. They can hear right away, early on in the message, what the big idea is, and then decide if they want to continue to read the whole document or put it aside and read it later. And usually we use this format because we know that this is just an easy request for some information, or we're providing somebody with some information about something, or we're responding in some way to a simple everyday kind of message. But when we are talking about messages that require a little bit more persuading, where we have to convince somebody of something, we know they're going to be a little hesitant about it, or we have to give them bad news about something, then we use the other approach, the other organizational pattern, which is called the indirect approach. So rather than front-loading the main idea up front, we spend a little bit of time making our case, if you want to think of it that way, providing evidence, giving reasons, talking a little bit about the situation before we actually tell the person what the main idea of the document is. So we're going to start with persuasive messages. So a couple of questions to ask ourselves: what kinds of persuasive messages do we write? And how do persuasive messages differ from everyday routine correspondence messages? Well, again, persuasive messages that we write are going to be things that, messages that are asking a lot of our reader, potentially. And so if we know that we are writing to convince our reader to take some kind of an action that we would like them to take, that could be donating money to a charity that you're writing on behalf of, for instance, or maybe we're asking somebody to implement a solution or a recommendation that we've made, and maybe that solution is not necessarily going to be a popular solution. Maybe people are going to have questions and doubts about it. If we are asking somebody to give a lot of their time, or contribute their money, or contribute their reputation perhaps to a project, so we're asking them to attach their name to some piece of work perhaps that you're doing, we might in that case also be writing persuasively. And if we know that our reader is going to perhaps be resistant to the idea in our message, so they might be worried that whatever you're suggesting might cost too much, or it might take too much time, or it's just not a very good recommendation, not a very logical solution, or they don't want to take the action that you're asking them to take. We know they're going to be resistant, and so we know we're going to have to do a lot of persuading. Then we're writing persuasively. Right? These are messages that take a little bit more time to develop because we have to really think about our audience, and we have to think about what our purpose is and what the outcome is that we're looking for out of the message. when we are writing these kinds of messages, then, in terms of organization, we use the indirect pattern of organization, as opposed, again, to the direct or front-loading approach. And that's because, as the writer, we have to have a little bit more time to describe the details of the situation before presenting our request or our solution, before we make the big ask. We have to build our case. If we were to state right up front in the very first sentence or two of a message that we're looking for a $10,000 donation to our charity, it's very possible that the reader would simply say right off the bat, no. They would not even read the rest of the message and consider it, because it would just be too much of a request, too large of a request for the reader, and they might feel really hesitant. So what we really want to do here with persuasive messages is convince the reader to keep reading. We want them to read the whole thing and to hear all of the details, and to really hopefully be convinced by the end of the message that what you're asking them for or what you're asking them to do makes sense and is good for them as well as for you and anybody else involved. So this is a typical structure then for an indirect persuasive messages. There are 5 parts here to this structure, and that does not necessarily mean that we have to have 5 paragraphs. We could still have 3 paragraphs. Remember, every message is standard 3 paragraphs at least: introduction, body, and conclusion. But we have 5 distinct parts or sections to an indirect persuasive message. Keep in mind that certain sections could be combined into a single paragraph. Okay? So these are the 5 sections. So as opposed to a front-loaded or a direct approach message, you'll notice that we don't say right away what the main idea is, what the request is, right? Because we know we have to build our case a little bit. So we start the first part of a persuasive message with a detailed description of the situation or the problem that you're facing. And this is where you want to be clear to the reader how that problem is relevant to them. How does it affect them? Is it going to be a problem for them in terms of money lost? Is it going to be an issue with time? Is it going to be inconvenient? How is it going to impact the reader? How does it impact you? How does it impact other people who might be involved? So build the case by describing the situation, describe the problem, give some detail, right, before you move into the next part of the message, which is where you explain then what your request or your recommendation is. So this is where you would make your ask, where you make it clear to the reader what the purpose is here. You are going to ask that person for something, or you're going to recommend that they do something. So this is where you want to focus on, why this solution or recommendation is practical, right? Why this request is workable, why it should appeal to the reader. So think about what your reader really values, what interests them, what do they think is important, and what's going to appeal to them, right? After that, this might seem a little bit strange, but you're actually going to have to acknowledge any downsides to your idea, to your request, to your recommendation. You have to say to the reader, essentially, I've done all my homework. I know that there could be some negatives associated with my idea. So it could be that, yes, in the short term, there will be extra cost involved in implementing this solution. Or there could be a lot of time that has to be spent in taking this action. Or there could be disruptions to our schedule. But then, as soon as you've acknowledged any negatives, and the reason that we do that really is to assure the reader we're aware that there could be downsides, so they can't come back, right? We're anticipating their objections. If you think about payback, the O, objections, we're anticipating any objections that they might have and wanting to answer those objections. We want to try to convince them we understand there might be a problem here, but that's when we slide into reader benefits. And that's the 4th part of an indirect persuasive message, is to mention what the benefits are then. So even though there may be some disadvantages to this idea that we have, or this recommendation we're making, or this request that we're making, here are the benefits that outweigh those disadvantages. So again, benefits to the reader, benefits to you, benefits to the community, benefits to the environment, whomever might be involved. You want to mention concrete benefits that will hopefully convince the reader, again, to consider at least taking this action that you're asking of them. At the very end of the message then, this is the 5th section of the message, is where you make a direct request for some action. So this could be a request that the reader implement the solution that you're suggesting, take you up on the request that you're asking for, or perhaps just consider it. It could be, a request to respond to you, to get back to you by a certain date. And it's always helpful to provide a reader with a date by which to act. Obviously, you want to give them a reasonable amount of time to do that, but by giving them an end date, so a date by which they should respond to you or take the action or implement the solution, it helps them to know how to schedule their own work. It's not rude, it's just a benefit to them to know, okay, I need to get back to this person by the end of next week. Okay? So those are the 5 sections that we are going to work with for the 4th assignment, when you will write an indirect persuasive message. In this case, for your assignment, it will be to your fellow classmates. And we'll talk more about that in class next week. So I'm going to turn now to negative messages, and we'll run through the layout for negative messages using the indirect approach as well. There are a lot of similarities between writing persuasively and writing negatively, but there are some differences too, so we need to cover this separately. So again, a couple of questions to ask ourselves. What kinds of negative messages do we write, and how do negative messages differ from routine correspondence messages? So really, you're writing negative or bad news messages by a few things. So when we write messages that deliver unwelcome news to a reader, so this would be news that a reader really isn't happy to receive. So this could be a denial of a claim, let's say. So you have made a request for your money back for something, and you're being told, no, you can't have your money back. Or you've had an unsuccessful interview for a job, and the company responds by letting you know that you are not the person who will be getting the job. Or maybe there's been a policy change in the workplace, and some people might not find that a good thing. They might be unhappy about that policy change. In those cases, we know we're writing negative messages or bad news for our receiver. Well, we know that there's a chance that the news that we are sending might hurt or perhaps anger our receiver, our reader. We're writing negative messages. And when we know that there's a need to not necessarily, in some cases, place blame on the reader, so we want to convey bad news or negative news, but we don't want to specifically lay the blame on somebody's shoulders for something that's happened, then we're writing negative messages. And again, in terms of organization for negative messages, we use the indirect pattern as opposed to the front-loaded direct approach, because just like with persuasive messages, we need some time at the beginning of the message to explain the situation before we give them the bad news. If we were to give them the bad news right away, right in the first sentence or two, you didn't get the job, or you're not getting your money back, or here's this big policy change that you're not going to like, chances are that you're going to get a bad response from your reader, the kind of response you don't want. And if this person happens to be a customer, a client, someone that you really want to maintain an ongoing relationship with, a parent perhaps, in the case of those of you who are in ECE, you don't want to destroy the relationship that you have with your reader. So you want to make sure that you deliver the news in such a way that it doesn't hurt them, doesn't anger them, that they understand why it's bad news, why it's a no, again, without ruining that relationship. So we need to have a little bit of time to present reasons for the bad news before you actually make the statement of the bad news. So here is a typical structure then, using that 5-part layout for an indirect negative message. And again, just like with persuasive messages, sometimes you can combine some of these sections, particularly the section where you provide specific reasons for the bad news, and then the statement of bad news itself. We can combine those into one paragraph. So you could have 3 paragraphs in a negative message. You could have 6 paragraphs. You could have 10 paragraphs, depending on how much information you have. But these, again, are the 5 sections that you would want to make sure you covered in your message. So we start a negative message with something called a buffer. So that opening to the message should be a neutral statement that allows you to basically hold off on giving the bad news. So this is something like a neutral opening, such as, thank you for coming in for the interview last week. It was really great to meet you. All right. That opening does not tell the reader that this is a bad news message. It just opens on a neutral level. It's finding common ground with your reader. It's pleasant. It's polite. So we open on a neutral note. We don't want to give away that it's bad news just yet. The next part of the message, then, we move into building, again, our case here. So offering reasoning for why this is going to be bad news. So again, if it's about an interview that didn't go well, this might be the part of the message where the writer would say, we interviewed many very qualified people last week, and we had some very difficult decisions to make. All right, so we're starting to present reasons for why this person, this reader, is not the person who's going to get the job. And then in the middle of the message, basically the if you want to think of the meat in the sandwich, we sandwich the bad news in the middle of the message. So it's not at the beginning and it's not at the end. It's in the middle. And we do have to make a clear statement of the bad news. We can't take a chance that the person will misunderstand and think that it's good news. We want them to know, it's a sign of respect, to just be direct with them and to say, unfortunately, you will not, be working with this company. Unfortunately, we went with somebody else. We've chosen somebody else to fill that position. However you want to word that, but you need to be clear that it is bad news. And we only want to do that one time. So we don't want to keep repeating the bad news. We don't want to say, and by the way, you didn't get the job, and don't forget you didn't get the job. One time is enough. As long as you're clear, one time is enough. And as soon as you've given the bad news, you can also provide, if possible, any alternatives or any compromises that you might have in mind. So even though this person maybe isn't going to get the job, you could always say something, if it's true, like, we'll be hiring again next year. Please feel free to resubmit your resume for consideration next year. It's an alternative. It allows the reader to feel like, okay, it's bad news this time around, but maybe the door isn't completely shut and I can try again next year. Only offer alternatives, of course, if they are real and honest and you really can carry them out. Then we finish the last part of an indirect negative message. We finish with what's called a goodwill ending. And this is where we want to end on a positive note. So we want to thank the person. We want to, again, tell them that we enjoyed meeting them. We want to finish the message off on a positive, happier note so that the person goes away feeling at least okay about our relationship. It's a bit like a roller coaster ride. You sort of start on the level with your reader at the beginning of the message. You take them down into the bad news and you bring them back up again at the end into the more positive news. And hopefully that will allow you to maintain your good working relationship with that person. There are some techniques for delivering bad news that can help to soften the blow. So in that middle part of the message where you make the clear statement of bad news, there are 3 techniques, and they're actually covered in the module on Blackboard on persuasive and negative messages, which we'll look at in a moment. So you may want to visit those and consider them. One of those methods is to use the passive voice. So you may remember we talked about active and passive voice, and I said that sometimes you might want to use passive voice sentences to deliver bad news, because it takes the emphasis off of the person who maybe, is either receiving the bad news or has done something to create the bad news. So there's less blame, and it takes the emphasis on the people who are involved, right? The personalities involved, and really just puts the focus on the news itself, on the action itself. So that's a possibility. When you're writing negative messages, you might want to employ the passive voice more. So a final word here, before we just take a quick look at that module over on Blackboard, a note about subject headings. So we've been talking about the fact that obviously only memos and emails generally contain subject headings. So we have our 2 from, date, and subject. So when writing persuasive or negative messages in memo or email format, we have to be careful with our subject headings. So here are 2 rules of thumb. Make your subject headings for persuasive messages either positive or neutral, and avoid including the specific request or recommendation that you will be making in the message. And the reason why is, again, you don't want to reveal what that big ask is, for fear that your reader might not read past the subject heading. They may form an opinion and simply decide, no, I'm not interested. Again, we want them to read the whole document and really consider it. And when it comes to negative messages, make your subject headings either neutral and solution focused, and make sure that you're avoiding disclosing the bad news. So what this means is, don't put the bad news right up there in the subject heading, because again, we want to build our case a little bit before we tell them what the bad news is. So if you give it away in the subject heading, it's very possible that you may hurt, insult, or anger your reader, because they will not have read through all the reasoning before they had a chance to see what the bad news is. Okay. All right, I'm going to go over to Blackboard, and under Learning Materials, okay, I'm just going to click on that again. You'll see there's another module, and you'll also see here when I release it, which I will do shortly, the notes from the PowerPoints that we just looked at. So I'll put them up in PDF format for you so you have all those. But this is the module that you want to check out on persuasive and negative messages. And just like with the previous modules, you can just click through. There are some little exercises that you can do to review some of our material. There's that graphic with the direct approach and the indirect approach, just to remind you. And just click through by hitting next. Here's some review of the order, the 5 parts for persuasive messages. So you can, this is a jumbled order activity, so you can just move them around to wherever you think they should be, whatever order, and then you can check your answer. And then there are descriptions for each section of that 5-part layout. Again, what we've just gone through in the PowerPoint, but it's just there for review. A little exercise about subject headings, subject lines for persuasive messages, which one will get the better response from the reader and why. So you can pick which one you think and then click through next. And then there's a helpful checklist here about indirect persuasive messages, things that you might want to ask yourself when you're writing persuasive messages, particularly when you're in the editing phase. And then the same material for negative messages. There's a jumbled order activity. You can go through and check your answer. Some descriptions of that 5-part layout again for negative messages. Another little activity for subject heading for negative messages. checklist for negative messages, right? With those helpful questions to ask about your negative message. And then these 3 techniques that I mentioned, so ways to soften the effects of bad news. All right, so you can go through here, try these out, practice some of them, right? So the first technique is to use a subordinate or a dependent clause to put your negative news in. So you can try these out. The second is passive voice verbs. Okay? So just like we talked about, difference between active voice and passive voice, you can do some practice here on this. Compare your answer to the answers that are provided. And then the third technique is something called implied refusals. And again, you can give this a try too, read about what it's about, and then try your own hand here at some sample questions. Okay? So, that's it for persuasive and negative messages. And as I say, when we're back in class next week, so I'll see you on Wednesday of next week, we will be discussing our final assignment 4, which will involve writing a persuasive message. And so we will put some of this into practice. And until then, if you have any questions or concerns as you're finishing up your 3rd assignment, you know that that's due by 11:59 p.m. on Friday of this week. If you have any questions or concerns, as always, just be in touch. You can send me an email to my Humber email or here on Blackboard through course messages. All right, everybody. Hope you're having a great week. Take care, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye for now.